So welcome to the 4th annual Andrew Mack Memorial Lecture hosted by the School for International Studies here at Simon Fraser University. My name is Nazanin Sharokni and I'm an associate professor at the School for International Studies here at SFU. This event has become one of our biggest events of the year and a flagship event for the school that kicks off our academic year. It's also a key activity organized by our Simons Chair, Professor Megan McKenzie, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, and that's why I'm taking the stage on her behalf. A couple of housekeeping notes. As you've already noticed, this event is being recorded, and you may see members of our team taking photographs for the school. And also after the lecture, there will be a short Q&A, and I'll be happy to facilitate that. So hold on to your questions until then. I will say more about the school, the Andrew Mack Fund, and introduce our speaker in a minute. But before I do any of that, I want to start this event properly and with respect to the fact that we are gathered here on Indigenous land. I'd like to introduce Elder Grunty Terry May Gallegos. Terry May belongs to the Tla'amin Nation with strong sacred matrilineal connections to her community. Since 1995, she has served as an Indigenous resource teacher with Coquitlam Board of Education, where her leadership and teaching have touched generations of students and colleagues. In the late 1990s, during a feast and naming ceremony hosted by the Nuncomb Youth Dance Group, Terry May's great aunt, Agnes McGee, gifted her the name Setlakus, a name that calls her to remember who she is and where she comes from. She has since also earned the affectionate name Grunty, reflecting the deep bonds she holds with her nieces, nephews, and community. Terry May holds both a Bachelor and Master of Education from UBC, where she focused on Indigenous pedagogies. Her work embodies the values of cultural diversity, connection, and community. She understands resilience and hope, and she shares what she calls big auntie energy, walking alongside others with wellness, generosity, and heart-filled intention. So please join me in welcoming Terry May Gallegos Setlakus, whose presence and teaching continue to inspire, nurture, and strengthen community.
Hello, good evening. I imagine it's the evening now. I would like to honor and acknowledge and raise my hands to the organizers who have requested an elder to come and acknowledge or welcome this wonderful event that is taking place. I cannot welcome you onto the territory because we are on the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, Coast Salish. I am Coast Salish from the Tla'amin Nation. How many of you have been to Paul River, BC, now known as Paul River? That is my traditional territory, the Tla'amin people, and my village is Tishosam. I cannot welcome you because I'm not from this territory, but we can acknowledge together that we are doing the good work and keeping the conversations courageous and heartfelt. So I'd like to thank you for allowing me to come and articulate why I feel that this backlash to breakthrough at human security intersect. I'm wearing orange today. Yes, I still work for Coquitlam School District as a district Indigenous resource teacher. It is my 30th year. I am a baby elder, so to be or not to be. Yes, I shall be that baby elder that has that big anti-energy. And yes, I get the discounts at Denny's, so I qualify to be invited to these events and to witness the good work that you're all doing today. In Paul River, in Catholic, on my nation, we're honoring Orange Shirt Day. Also throughout the school districts, throughout the organizations, my heart feels happy, full of gratitude. I brought my mom here with me today. She was a residential school survivor. My sister went to residential school. And what will keep the conversations going is understanding the past and moving forward. We need allyship. Allyship and how we can peacefully work together. What I can articulate that hurts my heart is that in Paul River, Cathet, Tla'amin, my traditional lands, we had the orange shirts set up. Well, we, my nation. Those orange shirts were removed because some people oppose and have the backlash that residential schools didn't exist. I know firsthand that my mom went to residential school, even though she did not speak about it. It was the anger, the violence, the turbulent times of living on the reserve. And I could say, yes, the reserve, because we didn't sign a treaty. A reserve was for First Nations people when we were getting kicked off our own lands into smaller parcels of land. However, we signed a treaty in 2016, so I believe I could be 9 years old, I guess, with not living under the Indian Act. And there's a gentleman in the audience here who knows I guess you'd be my nephew. And I'm like, yeah, so you know the good work of the Tla'amin people. And when we educate ourselves and we listen to our guest speaker who will discuss and have those courageous, heartfelt, articulating conversations on why moving forward matters, it'll bring peace to our hearts, minds, and souls. So thank you for allowing me to come up. And how about if we just raise our hands ever so gently? Just raise your hands and acknowledge that you and I and everyone in here, every child matters. We are here to have courageous conversations. So thank you for your time. Imat.
Thank you very much, Granty, for opening our gathering in such a meaningful way. And with that, we are honored to begin today's event. And before we do that, I want to say a little bit about the school, Andrew Mack and Andrew Mack Lecture Series, and then I'm excited to introduce our speaker for the evening. The School for International Studies at SFU offers interdisciplinary research and teaching on global affairs. What makes us unique is threefold. First, we're truly interdisciplinary, with faculty drawn from political science, sociology, geography, anthropology, and international relations. Second, we bring deep regional expertise with leading scholars on China, Russia, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. Third, we're committed to public and policy engagement. Our faculty publish op-eds, policy briefs, and appear regularly in the media, while our students go on to careers in government, NGOs, and international policy. The school was founded on the belief that global challenges demand multiple perspectives and collaborative solutions. At a time of pandemics, wars, and climate crises, our interdisciplinary approach and commitment to critical thinking are more valuable than ever. We have amazing staff in the school, including those that helped organize this event, and I want to give special thanks to Ellen Yap, who could not be here tonight, and Catalina Bobadilla Sandoval, Joel Lee, who is going around taking photos, and Jocelyn Cartmill, and also to our graduate student, Michaela Bamba, for their work organizing and helping host this event. So we are here tonight for the 4th annual Andrew Mack Lecture on Human Security. Andrew Mack was an adjunct professor in the School for International Studies at SFU, almost from its foundation in 2007. He founded the Human Security Project Report, which was a peace and conflict studies research group that published regular reports that were engaged with around the world. Professor Mack's work helped legitimize and bring more attention to the concept of human security, which is a concept that was first introduced and used by the UN in 1994, and was really pushing the boundaries of how security was defined. Until 1994, security was primarily defined in military terms, and the focus of security studies was largely war and national borders. As a concept, human security required us to think beyond mere human survival and consider what it meant to live with freedom from fear and want. The concept of human security and work that included the Human Security Report Project pushed security studies to consider issues like sexual violence in war, child soldiers, famine, and other forms of insecurity. To do this work well, it required that we listened to different voices to understand how certain populations might be facing insecurity. Unfortunately, Andrew Mack passed away in 2020. The Andrew Mack Fund was set up in his honor, and this speaker series is a way to highlight work that continues his legacy. The Mack Lectures have been a collaboration with the school and Andrew Mack's wife, Laura Mack. We're grateful that Laura has been a part of choosing the keynote speaker for these lectures from year one. And that gets us to the introduction of our speaker. It is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Camellia Bryan. She's an assistant professor in the Organizational Behavior and Human Resources Division at UBC's Sauder School of Business, where she studies the psychology of diversity in organizations, why resistance and backlash to equity initiatives arise, and importantly, how those very moments can be transformed into opportunities for learning, allyship, and cultural change. Dr. Bryan is a path-breaking researcher asking new questions about diversity and equity at a moment when many institutions are rolling back their commitments. Rather than accepting backlash as inevitable, she reframes it as an opportunity, a moment that, if handled thoughtfully, can become the start of real transformation. Her widely cited Academy of Management review article, titled Beyond Backlash, has already opened up new conversations in organizational behavior, social psychology, and feminist theory, and it is shaping how leaders and scholars alike think about the future of equity work. Her research speaks directly to the commitments of our School for International Studies. For a gathering focused on human security, Dr. Bryan's scholarship offers something essential. Human security is about people's safety, dignity, and belonging, not just in conflict zones, but in our everyday institutions. When organizations scale back equity efforts or mishandle difference, they don't just miss HR targets. They undermine the foundations of social trust that communities rely on. Dr. Bryan's research provides leaders with evidence-based approaches to design for psychological safety, to transform discomfort into dialogue, and to convert performative initiatives into meaningful, measurable change. Equally important, her work is deeply interdisciplinary, another key commitment of the school. Trained in organizational behavior, she brings together insights from psychology, management studies, and gender studies, while ensuring her research is accessible to policymakers, educators, and the public. Beyond her publications, she is a gifted communicator, engaging with media and writing for wider audiences to bridge scholarship and practice. Dr. Camellia Bryan is a pioneer whose work expands the way we think about security, and that makes her an ideal voice to lead this Mack lecture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Camellia Bryan.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to give this lecture. And the topic for today is on From Backlash to Security, how DEI and human security intersect, and why moving forward matters. And this is very relevant, especially given everything that's going on right now, both in Canada and also to our neighbors to the south, of why this is important. DEI backlash is not just a threat to DEI initiatives, it's a threat to human security because it's threatening people's sense of belonging, their comfort in communities, and just being able to be safe to be yourself. When they turn back DEI initiatives, it's making people who have disabilities, people who are racialized, people who have different sexualities and genders feel less accepted. And this is clearly something that is going on. It's been happening a lot more recently. I just have a clip of some recent media articles that show this. So for example, Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Meta, he went from making statements saying that Black Lives Matter is very important to now saying that, for example, we need to bring more masculinity and getting rid of their DEI initiatives. It's also been happening in a lot of tech companies, and it's also things are happening this year with the new President of the United States. There's been lots of retrenchments both in the government, society level, and it's happening there. But it's also happening on a bigger level and also happening, unfortunately, in Canada as well. So this was an article that was actually just published this year where in Transport Canada, they did a DEI training. And in the DEI training, they had backlash where people were expressing skepticism. They said that they didn't believe the residential school system happened, even though it clearly did. And this was very harmful for the people who had to lead a training who were Indigenous. And so even though a lot of people talk about the backlash that's happening and they feel like this is something that's just happening in America, it's starting to happen in Canada. So it's important for us to be proactive and think of ways to disrupt this. Because when we have backlash, it's really threatening at the core of human security in this way. And I know I've been talking a lot about backlash. I know we're also experiencing it right now, but I'm just going to add a bit more clarity. So DEI backlash, it's negative reactions to initiatives aimed at promoting equity and inclusion. And there's research showing that this happens. It's become a lot more rampant now. But for example, when companies appoint somebody who is a racial minority or CEO as their CEO of the company, they actually have less support from their white male board members. They become less identified with the company. There's also, for example, reverse discrimination fears is also something that can come from backlash, where people who maybe feel like they used to be advantaged in organizations now feel like they'll be penalized. And another issue as well is they've shown, for example, when some men complete sexual harassment training, they actually become more victim blaming, which is very unfortunate. And this is really concerning for human security because people who are in organizations where they have DEI practices, it's actually harder for you to report discrimination. The idea is that when you have these policies, well, it should be more egalitarian. And when we're thinking about this and the whole problem of backlash, what's causing it and what's making it happen? So from my research and also research of others, it's really coming from dominant social identity threat where groups are feeling threatened. They feel as if they're losing their resources. They feel like it's an attack on their values. And it's causing that in this way. We have, for example, when the capital of the US was stormed was a really extreme example of that. And what are things that people can feel threatened by? So, for example, some people felt very threatened by the murder of George Floyd. That led some people to become much more engaged in learning, which I can get into. Also, some people led to what we currently have as in the US. Also, for example, a colleague's trans disclosure. So if you have a coworker who discloses that they're trans or somebody does, that can be quite threatening for people, it's been shown. And also just diversity training as well can be quite threatening as well to people, as we've already discussed. So there is already research on backlash, so I won't review that too much, but some people have tried to affirm people, they've tried to make them feel more secure, we've done that in trainings. We've also, for example, said, well, you know what, this is just a learning opportunity. But I'm going to argue I don't think that is sufficient because people still have their existing understandings, and that's leading to this threat to human security. People have ideas of their gender, of how their race, of how their sexuality is, or history that are very threatening. So this is actually a conversation that's been now happening. So this was also a recent LinkedIn post by Erica James, who is the head of the Warren School of Business. And she's discussing how people become quite threatened, they become really rigid, and they double down on what they're already thinking, which we can see. But if you can work through that threat, it can actually help people overcome it and become learning. And that's going to be the more positive angle where we're now going to turn the talk towards. How can we facilitate learning? And I have real life examples of how this can happen. So there's a really illustrative example right here of a New York Times journalist who was completing Robin DiAngelo's white fragility training. And he says he felt quite threatened during the training. But he actually pauses to consider, why is he feeling so threatened? And he says, am I being fragile? Am I actually doing what this training, which we've been talking about? And it's leading to a reflection process. And that's what real focus is about. How can we get people to start reflecting in this way and to have these thoughts instead of simply doubling down and just becoming more triggered and more threatened? And to start off, I actually have a very extreme example that really shows what this process could be like. So the gentleman here, he actually used to be a key figure in the alt-right. So if you know people, for example, like Alex Jones, Stephen Molyneux, he was the video editor. He helped to create all those videos. So much misinformation and threats to human security he has been an essential part of. But he actually had realizations through his reflection of when he saw the 2019 shooting. He realized that he was actually contributing to a lot of problematic things in society. He realized he was harming people and threatening human security. And when he started to process that, he actually did a complete change, and he's actually now the leader of an organization. It's a nonprofit called Future Freedom, where he's working now to de-radicalize people. And I think this is a real inspiration in that if he can move from being so deeply entrenched in all of this anti-DEI backlash, thinking that things are very anti-woke, and coming through, I think we have a lot of potential as we educate people. And so, although I know people are becoming discouraged because there is some backlash going on right now, it's important to consider learning, because when people are experiencing critical events that are really challenging how they see the world, which is what happened when we have, for example, things like George Floyd, it can really open learning. And there is research on this of transformational learning. It's been done on how individuals, like adults, can develop their own understandings of the world. And it's reflecting on how your underlying interpretations are, and you're reconciling it with conflicting information. So my research uses this approach to facilitate how we can discuss how people can disrupt their existing understandings and develop new knowledge that's more supportive and leading to allyship. So there's two constructs like I've developed, and this is a really important part of how this learning process can happen, because typically they focus on how people can simply become threatened and double down their understanding. So that's, for example, people who feel threatened, for example, by diversity training, becoming more anti-Black, becoming more anti-Indigenous, and showing more bias. But opening is when you have thoughts, speech, and actions that actually make people reflect more deeply on how they understand the world, how they think about the world. And those are the examples that we've just shown earlier, where people are engaging at and reflecting more deeply. And you can engage this reflection in lots of different levels. So there's two different levels. You can just simply look at the underlying assumptions, or you can look into it very deeply and reflect on it critically and think things like, for example, why do I have certain views of these genders? Why do I have a not-binary view of gender? And thinking about it really deeply, that really moves learning much more deeply in that way. And this also then goes into, well, how are these different? So I'm just going to go into a simple way of understanding is that closing is just closing yourself off from more knowledge. Surface level opening is opening yourself up to new knowledge when you're feeling threatened. So these two parts are important, and now I'm just going to get into dialogue and how we can facilitate this dialogue, how can we make this more practical. So when people are going through this learning process, dialogue is a crucial part. Think about it. We're learning right now, as we're discussing, we're learning. I'll also learn from you as well in Q&A, and feedback on how your learning really facilitates this. And this introduces dialogue across perspectives, where you're engaging in dialogue with people who have divergent perspectives from you. And this was really important, for example, for many people I've researched who have these experiences, where they do talk to people who have different experiences and different backgrounds, and they're able to realize that. And the important part, and these are important things that we can all create, is that you need to have a divergent perspective, but you need to have safety in the dialogue. Because I think many of us have seen that there's been lots of discussions about diversity, and unfortunately, we're still having to have these conversations about backlash and why is this happening. So when people are able to have safety and actually talk about what they truly think, it can lead to a lot of corrective learning. So a really great example I have that I've been found in my research is there was a company that engaged in a DEI training, and they decided to put in initiatives. And the whole company became very against it because they thought that they were now going to be under threat. They wouldn't get the same promotions. Maybe they wouldn't promote certain racial groups or gender groups. But what happened is they actually created a town hall, and a manager was really close to them and said, hey, like, he didn't attack anyone, he didn't pinpoint anyone, he just said, I think there's been some conversations, I think there's some miscommunication, I just want to talk this out. So they had a talk for many hours, and they were actually able to understand it wasn't changing promotions, it wasn't taking away, they were just simply trying to expand the pie and create more resources for some of their coworkers who they ended up learning through this town hall were experiencing a lot of barriers they didn't realize. And that's the real power of dialogue in that way. And this has been done even in countries that aren't Western. So for example, in Uganda, it, for example, is a very patriarchal society, they were able to create a group where men could talk about their masculinity, talk about men's issues, think about how they treat women, and this led to learning for them. So really important part of this is when you're engaging in this dialogue, I know sometimes people think, well, you're putting more burdens on people who are already marginalized, now they have to do the work, which does happen, unfortunately. But no, you could be somebody who's dominant and engage in these kinds of conversations. Even myself, I have been able to engage in conversations for identities I don't have, and I've seen this work for other people as well. And sometimes it can even be more persuasive in that way because it seems as if you're advocating in a non-self-interested way. So now thinking more about action, because we've talked about some ideas, what can we do? What can we do for an action-oriented way in both an individual level and community? So for an individual, I'll start off with that. It's sitting with the discomfort instead of shutting it down. So if somebody, for example, has an issue with a DEI initiative, if they're not expressing it in a problematic way, being able to engage in conversation and being able to talk about that can actually be very important in the early stages. So I, for example, teach at a business school. Although I don't teach DEI in the class, sometimes my students have questions about it. They hear something in the news, they want to talk about it with me, and I try to be as open as I can about it, and I find that sometimes it's just they misunderstood something. So when it's happening early on, that's when we can really start to disrupt it. Also, there is still very serious challenges happening right now to the human security for people who are, for example, transgendered, people who are racialized, people who have disability, people who, for example, are undocumented. So what you can do is, it's really important now to move beyond performative allyship to substantive allyship and using real actions that can really show that and really understanding their perspectives. Also, engaging in dialogue rather than avoidance. I know that is sometimes easier said than done because often people feel really uncomfortable talking about these topics, especially if someone is saying something problematic. You might not know how to talk to them, how to address it. This was a question I've gotten, like, how can we engage in this dialogue? I know you're talking about it. How can we do that? So I have some steps as well on how that can happen, so you have some actionable ways of doing that. So one part I think is really important is to listen before responding, so understand what is their perspective. Why do they have these views in that way? So if you can understand that, that's how you can start to disrupt this. So it might just be misinformation, it might just be, if it's, for example, just incredible bigotry, that will be much harder for you to disrupt, so I don't want to say this will work with every single person. But you can also do that when you listen to them and you understand that. Also being able to talk about your story and also being able to understand them, engaging in the dialogue, because think about it, it's between the both of you. You're sharing experiences, they're sharing experiences, you're sharing your perspectives, and they are also sharing their perspectives. And also asking open questions, because you want to get them to think more deeply and probe in that way. And this is something I've done, for example, with even family members, for example, with social identity groups who might not understand. And I think sometimes, not every single time this has worked, but when I've engaged in this, I found that it actually helps them think about themselves and are starting to come to realizations themselves. Because if we just think about learning, people learn things more deeply when they process it themselves and they come to the awareness themselves. And that's the ideal, is that instead of telling them what to think, you're helping them come to these realizations. Also, an important part is allyship. So I just wanted to break down what would be really important and effective in the research they've shown on being substantive allyship. Because substantive allyship is something where you're really addressing the needs of the marginalized group. So an example that we've used before is there was a research study where a man simply told a woman, you need to lean in and you need to be more of a feminist. And that was his idea of how he's an ally. And he said, I'm an ally. But okay, we can see from the reactions in the room that's not how to be an ally, so do not do that. But the problem was that he was kind of putting all the onus on her, and he was kind of telling her, well, you need to fix things. And he was also telling her what to do, which was really just affirming that dynamic. Maybe if he had asked her, what could I do to maybe help you? What's your perspective? And that's what's really important in substantive allyship, is you're not centering yourself. You're not centering your emotions. You're not centering, all of these things are very upsetting. It's centering what you can do to help that person, and even being willing to sacrifice as well. That's what research has shown people who are marginalized really value in allyship and what they take seriously. Simply being performative just won't be enough, especially given what's going on. Now, when we think about it from a community level, What can we do for community? What can we do as organizations in order to disrupt this, in order to counter this? So one thing we can do is we can also see DEI as a really important tool for learning. It's a learning opportunity for us all. Not just for us to learn about other groups, but to learn about ourselves, to learn about how we see groups, how we think about power, and how can we create more secure societies for human security. Also, I think it's important to build safety for tough conversations and tough reflection. A lot of these conversations are just not happening in public, or at least they're not happening with people who are like ourselves. Instead, some people are actually having these conversations in private where they're becoming more anti-DEI. I'm doing some research now on people who are anti-DEI, and a common thing in the interviews is that when we ask, well, are you talking about this? And the company said, oh, no, absolutely not, absolutely not. But they do talk about it privately with some of their coworkers. And they privately might talk about it with their family, and that leads to the situations we currently have today. So being able to figure out why people are thinking about this way is very important. And also, I think it's important to be able to normalize conversations about diversity. That's something that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. When I give talks, for example, a lot of people come up to me and say, I'm really uncomfortable having these conversations, or I can't get people in my organization to have these conversations. But normalizing it, so for example, you can have town halls where you might share your experiences, and it can open people up. So for like when I'm teaching, I might share examples of things that happened to me, things that I didn't know as well, because I'm also not perfect as well. Also focusing on progress rather than perfection. I think just seeing this as something that people can learn and develop over time. It's a learning process. These are things that some people have had deeply ingrained in them from childhood and from society. So it's a very deep learning that you need to do and to undo that. So it does take time. So to end it off, I have another quote now of somebody who wrote a LinkedIn post where they were describing kind of this process of how he changed his views on affirmative action, where he discusses that he actually voted Republican his whole life and he was very anti-affirmative action, and he's a management consultant. And he actually is discussing how that whole process happened. He said, I was wrong. Evidence now suggests otherwise, so I must reevaluate my position. And I think that's the kind of thinking we're hoping to create, and that's what we can do, and that's the hope when we're having conversations with other people, that they start to realize when they've had and held incorrect information. If you're interested to learn more, I have a paper that goes into this in a lot more detail. This was a really scaled down version. Also, I am really interested in hearing your thoughts about this, or also if you want a copy of the paper, if you have any further questions, feel free to email me. I have my email, my website, as well as my LinkedIn. Thank you all so much. Yeah.
We deal with this problem that in cultural cognition,
Yeah.
we have egalitarian ideas, but in terms of their relational style, they have very hierarchical logic for their identity. So people carry this paradox within themselves, and so how can we engage that? And we need to explain how the process has to be a process of inquiry, where they themselves arise. So, how do you feel like, is there any other perspective or dimension we should keep in consideration?
So,
in that inquiry?
so are you talking about talking to people who come from cultures?
Paradoxical view.
Yes.
So, an inquiry, and this is the process by which we can make them aware. In that process, are there any other considerations would you say we should have in mind as to how we should conduct that inquiry, or that in how what are the qualities or attributes of that inquiry?
Oh, in terms of like some people they're trying to talk in egalitarian, but they're in a culture that's very hierarchical.
Yeah, for example, people may espouse egalitarian ideas, but in terms of their conduct, they are very hierarchical.
Oh, okay, I clicked for me. Okay, now it's clicked for me what you're asking about. So people who will say that they're very egalitarian, but their behavior is very hierarchical. So that does come up actually in allyship research, for example, where people say they're allies, but they'll actually say very problematic things and hold very problematic like system affirming beliefs. So this is not something that should be on the onus of people who are marginalized, but there are stories where they have actually respectfully just said, oh, I don't think you might be giving space for this person, or like, I know you mean very well, but, and then it kind of initiates a conversation about perhaps the roles and things that they didn't acknowledge. But this would have to be somebody who they are wanting to be an ally, and they're just coming from perhaps a bad, they're just doing it not out of malice. It's just about ignorance, that they haven't done enough reflection, they haven't considered what they're doing. In their head, they actually feel as if it's very beneficial in that way. Because like you said, maybe if you come from a society that's very hierarchical, you are implicitly, like my example with the man who just told her, well, you need to lean in, you need to do this. He's ordering her what to do. He's probably trying to be supportive, but he's still thinking of that understanding, so it's that reflection point. Oh, yes?
So sometimes when I've gotten to conversations with people and who are against DEI and explaining about how it's to remove barriers that exist and why it's so essential. And basically, they think that racism was in the past, that we have gone through that and we were over it, and now it's more racist to be telling people, you know, that they should, you know, again, getting a leg up. So I know that they're wrong. I'm also a white woman who has not experienced racism, and I don't know how to say you're wrong, that there are still barriers, and that it is about equalizing things, not giving advantage. And I just don't know what to say.
Okay, that's a really good question, and that's a very real question that I think people do deal with. So even if you don't have the identity, I think you could still say, for example, because there is a lot of research showing that these continue to be barriers. They've had recent research, for example, showing, I think this actually shocks a lot of people, that if you send out a resume with, for example, a Chinese name or a Black name, you'll get significantly less callbacks, and we're discussing the exact same resume. That often really shocks people. And for example, wealth inequality, that's a big difference amongst marginalized groups, for example, in terms of the wealth gap that exists. Things that have happened, for example, because I think what happens is sometimes they think a lot about the past. And compared to now, it seems as if there's been such huge progress because the past was so bad. But I think what's important for people to understand, I also communicate to other people, is those are still rippling effects, and the consequences of all of those terrible periods are still continuing now. So it's not as if it was just a terrible period of history. It's continued to have repercussions that groups are still experiencing. And I think when you just think about it from the past, you start to, they actually have done research on this. So when, for example, men think about all the injustices women have felt in the past, they become less supportive right now because they feel as if women have such a good place, but we know there's still a lot of work to be done.
I still would like to know what to say. You know, like,
oh, like
so
specifically
the
what to
problem
say?
is that I have no memory. Okay. So I can't remember stats. I can't remember. I mean, it's just so. It's just. I get so frustrated by my inability to engage in a conversation that would have them change their mind. I guess my goal is, how do I open them up to different perspectives?
Yeah, opening up to different perspectives. Well, something I just want to also just emphasize, the person also needs to be open to the information. So sometimes this will not work with every single person. We're hoping that person's, for example, I've talked to some people where it has not worked at all. But I'm just gonna assume in your situation, this person's open, but you want to engage in the conversation. You can find out, because sometimes what's happening is there's something underlying all these beliefs and all the things we're saying that is causing this. So if you can correct that or examine that. So I won't say, for example, you're wrong. I'd say, oh, so why do you think that? I remember I was having, for example, this is actually really relevant because it's not necessarily my identity, but somebody told me, oh, I support DEI, I support for these groups, but they said, this group does not deserve DEI. I don't feel as if they experience any discrimination in society, and this is a very high-income minority group, so they shouldn't. So it wasn't my identity, so I guess that person felt very comfortable. So to say that to me, but I actually was able to change their view, so I think this will be an example, maybe something you can use, where I didn't really say stats, I just said, well, I don't think maybe you understand that group's perspective, and I just said, there's things that that group is still experiencing in terms of, for example, stereotypes, I just said broadly, there's also ways that, for example, they're still not shown in the media. And I think I kind of just told her some points, and then she started thinking about it. She was like, yeah, that is a good point. Like, for example, I never see men of that group in the media. Or, for example, and then she realized, we were talking a bit more, she kind of thought about it, and she's like, okay, yeah, actually, I never thought about this group that way, because she was a bit oblivious to the barriers facing that group. But I think when I asked her, well, have you seen this? Have you seen that? It kind of clicked to her like, oh, this is actually a group. They might be doing very well economically, but they're still experiencing disadvantage in different ways that you haven't considered, you haven't conceived. Because I can't get into all here, there's a lot of like, what's their underlying assumptions? There's something deep under this, so just changing one belief isn't always enough. It's like, what's causing this? Like, they just feel as if this group has like the same status as, like, for example, like people in society. That's basically what they thought. But then I was able to just say, well, what about this, or what about that? And they could see from their own awareness, like, this is a very smart person, this is actually somebody who resumed their PhD. They could see that this was not fitting what they were thinking, and they were able to see, well, maybe I don't know this, maybe it's reflect more. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
It does? Okay. Oh, yes?
Yeah, I guess my question would be, like, how do you see these open dialogues occurring in a digital space? Just because a lot of people are further radicalized by algorithms, and a lot of us, especially younger generations, are living their lives increasingly online through social media, through these digital platforms that have biased algorithms. So my question would be, like, how would you open dialogue in a digital space with the caveat in mind that, like, these algorithms are not on our side?
That's a really insightful question. So, okay, there's two parts to that. So I'll give you, actually, there's some evidence. They're actually doing work on that right now, because I have a project I'm working on like former white nationalists. And, okay, this is a little kind of a funny story, but I was doing a lot of research looking up former like white nationalism as part of the project. I actually got a warning from Google saying like, oh, like, and they tried to redirect me towards this association for former white nationalists. I guess I was getting a targeted ad for being radicalized in that way. So there are actually some social media companies that this might have been defunded, but they actually had a branch, for example, of Google that was specifically focused on dealing with radicalization when you were looking at that. But I think online it would be harder, but I think what can happen as well is just providing information for people to learn about. So for example, for them to feel comfortable about, even just like a short video or something that's very educational in that way. I do think, like, because this is like very personal conversations, and from the research I've done so far, people who do engage in conversations, it's not something you just say like, oh, I just met you, I'm going to talk about all these deep root things. It's usually there was some comfort, they feel a lot of safety. I think it's really important though to have campaigns perhaps where you can actually start to de-radicalize people and actually educate them. There also is, like, for example, charities like, for example, like After Hate, where they work to de-radicalize people as well. So there is like work in that area as well. Yes?
Well, I just want to share a success story.
Oh.
With my 30 years of teaching, I didn't feel accepted or welcomed. My degree, perhaps, because I'm the first to graduate from my small immediate family, like perhaps one would think my degree came from the Cracker Jack box. That's humor's good, right? So anyway, 30 years of forgiveness, of trying to understand. We don't know what we don't know. I do circle work in schools, and I've been referred to as you people. And maybe sometimes I may have said some cutting remarks back, so it's like articulating and having that sense of vulnerability drops our shoulders. When I do circle work, I call it circle work instead of talking circles. And I was looking at some of your slides, and I was like, oh yeah, that connects with what we do in the schools. And the one teacher I work with disowned that she came from Vietnam. Disowned the fact that her family left Vietnam to have a better life. Now on her signature, she writes her Vietnamese name. And I think that is a success story. And I just wanted to share that, those courageous conversations, sense of vulnerability, opening our heart, we'll see the results. And yes, there has been pushback, and it can get quite ugly, but if we just keep, moving forward, things will take place, trust the process. I just felt I needed to say that.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, so you talked about having these dialogues, especially in workplaces or other organizations. And I'm just wondering sort of how you balance making the space open and safe enough that people feel like they can authentically share how they're feeling about DEI measures, or you know, expressing their beliefs even though they might be, you know, a taboo or maybe like not appropriate for the workplace, but then also making sure that like the people, whether it be like racialized people or people with disabilities or what, so whether those people still feel safe and you know that there isn't continued harm being done within that dialogue.
Yeah, so that's a very important part. So also, just because you're having dialogue, I think you should also be clear, it's not like an open forum for you to say any bigoted, transphobic, racist, sexist, whichever of those in your conversation. Like, for example, when I was teaching DEI, I feel like you could question me, you could even like argue with me if you wanted, that I'm open to that. But I just had like a rule in the beginning, you can't say those types of things in the classroom or like you'll be removed from the class because it's offensive to other people. So we just had that boundary. So if somebody disagreed with something, they might question me about that, but they did so respectfully, and I said you need to be respectful to other people. I'm bringing it to like the workplace where you might, it's more work to remove people from the company. Something I was just talking actually to somebody who does DEI is you can, for example, just say be respectful in that way, but also having, so she was doing her company, they actually had an anonymous like open forum where you could write, it was just private, so only she would see it. And so I remember she was having a meeting with me to just talk about like all the concerns or the backlash she was experiencing within her company, but we were able to talk and strategize about that. And so maybe you need to have like some small groups where you can just talk to people and kind of subtly like inform them that's not the issue, like we're not trying to do something that's unjust in that way. I think that's a way to keep it safe in that way so that it's not open. But I think having clear boundaries and guidelines is just important in the dialogue in that way.
Has there been any work done on the root causes that these people have? I mean, we're talking about a conversation.
Yes.
I'm a status Indian. And unlike many status Indians in this country, I'm a professional, I'm an accountant. It took me 30 years to get in the door of some of these officials back east. But having a conversation, I don't even want to talk anymore because I'm running out of saying the same thing 1,000 times. But what is the root cause? Is there any work being done on what is the root cause of somebody who says, I do not want to see this happen? I do not want, in my case, a status Indian to shut themselves with it. You know, think about it in this country for a minute. We still have something called an Indian Act. I still have a number. It's not tattooed on me, but I still have a number. How can that exist? And who do you talk? How do you get rid of that kind of an attitude in an individual? Because what you're talking about is very good and needs to happen. Don't get me wrong. But until we understand what the root cause for people, is it economic disadvantage? Is it lack of education? Is it their parental upbringing? I mean, we look at our indigenous communities and the challenges they face. The non-indigenous community has, in my opinion, far worse issues in raising their children. And so what are the root causes? And I'd be interested in knowing if there's any work being done in that field.
Yeah, so that was actually part of the section I do talk about in my research paper. I just didn't bring it up here, but there is a lot of research in psychology. So there's like a topic construct, it's called social dominance orientation. So some people just naturally prefer hierarchy. So for example, they think this racial group is better than this racial group and so forth. They will fight for that hierarchy and they prefer things to be that way. If something is challenging that, they will just become uncomfortable and they will fight against that, and that leads to a lot of policies that are against human security in that way. And this has been robustly shown for like many, many years in psychology research, and that so far, I think it will be an amazing area of inquiry for somebody who can help to disrupt people who have social dominance orientation to undo that. There's been like a lot of research in the last 30 or 40 years understanding this and all the negative impact it has on our society, but right now we don't have research on how to get rid of that. because it's very strongly rooted. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just have so much to say, but I want to lead with just gratitude. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really lovely, informative and powerful. I really appreciate your optimism as well. So I teach in political science here. I'm half Japanese Canadian, and so of course my family was interned during the Second World War, and of course I've experienced anti-Asian racism and so on and so forth. And so I mention this because I live with the transgenerational, intergenerational trauma, and so it makes doing EDI work, anti work, really difficult and really challenging. And in my own research, I've written with Megan McKenzie and some of their piece in higher education on pushback and blowback in the post-secondary educational context, and we all kind of drew on our own experiences. A number of years ago, I worked as a special advisor for DEI here at SFU, and it was really, really difficult work for me because you want to see, of course, policy change, but you're also having to navigate your own. You're having to navigate the microaggressions, and then that's triggering, right, of the trauma that your family's experienced, and so on and so forth. My takeaway from that whole experience was that people in leadership positions, they have to want to sit with their fragility, and they have to be open to that, and they have to be able to linger in that and to recognize that. And when they're doing things like pushing back in the various ways, right? It just becomes incredibly frustrating. And so I don't know if there's a question in here. I mean, I guess my question is, how do you like when you're thinking about institutional change, and so it's not just the one person you're trying to change, but a whole university executive, for example. You're trying to change a whole bunch of people, and they're thinking, and to encourage that deep thinking that then can inform policy change. Like, how do you scale up? I guess is the question.
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. That's not like, I hadn't done a paper on that, but I can answer to that because I think the fundamental idea behind it is like, how do you do institutional change? How do you change something that's been established in organizations? And we have research on that. So a really good example actually of a company that had to kind of go through this is Uber, because they had the issue with Susan Fowler with her sexual harassment case. They had a very toxic masculinity culture. There's been a lot of cases on that, so I won't go into that because I read a lot about Uber and taught about it a lot. But they had to remove their CEO, Travis Kalanick, because of the culture that he created, where they were supporting people who were sexually harassing women because they were high performers. That was the excuse. And they protected them so heavily. So that was one thing they did, and they also actually changed all of, this is not something that every company can do, but this is probably how Streaming had to be to really transform it in that way, is they removed the CEO and they put in a new CEO. They changed, for example, they had a room called the War Room, which was like this really like adversarial war, and they actually renamed it the Peace Room. So that was a symbol to them, and they actually brought the whole board of directors in for a meeting with the whole company to show that the culture had changed. They also said we have new values, we're not doing things this way, it's a different Uber. They even changed the set of core values because Travis was obsessed with like Jeff Bezos, and he has a set of Amazon rules. And they had rules, for example, that were really toxic for a lot of the employees that they had to change. And it was in depth, but a part of that is because they were having a lot of pressure from their shareholders to make all of those changes, given that they were going to IPO. But that's how extensive it needs to be. But a really important part that we can use in companies is you do need the buy-in of the leaders. So that was an important thing when you're doing organizational change. The leaders need to come in and show that it's serious, if you're having, for example, new DEI programs, I say it's important to show that the CEO is taking this seriously. It's not just something that they're doing. Like that's something I'm working right now at a company where they want me to help their executives engage in the DEI conversations, because if they can model it, it will ripple forward in the company, rather than, for example, a person who's doing DEI, who often might not have as much power within the organization to influence people. So I think that's the way we would have to move. We really want to change these things in organizations, on like an institutional level, like you said.
Oh, hi. I'm just so serendipitous to hear you. I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. I guess, stop me in a minute, because I could go on forever. I've spent the last 4 years with people suffering with substance use disorders, fentanyl addiction in Victoria, and intense with them if they're under the Mental Health Act against their will. That's only relevant right now because I had no expectation at all going into that to be talking about the things you've just been talking about, and it ended up taking up an inordinate amount of my time. There were more arguments within that subset of the population around these issues than I've experienced outside of it. Please take this with grace. I'm not asking about neurodivergence in an uneducated way, but obviously there was a high degree of neurodivergence in the population as well as other challenges. And I found myself grateful it was me there moderating these conversations, because these were people who were chronically getting kicked out of everywhere because they were saying things that were considered inappropriate, or it was racist or whatever else. We made it through. I got burnt out by it, but I think my question is just, in this work, you know, where is that line where you give grace to people who perhaps are breaking hate crime laws just by the questions they're asking you are so inappropriate, or the language is so inappropriate? And like, how are we as a community going to navigate this for those who are suffering with severe mental health issues and don't want to be part of the problem? But I'll give you a concrete example. Like we couldn't apply for certain funds that people were trying to give us because people did not want to have a rainbow flag on our website because they were mortified. These were people who were in a wheelchair on the sidewalk begging, who were not white like me, right? And I was like, we're all in the same situation. Like, I'm disabled. Like, we're all in the same group, sorry. And they would have nothing of it. And I had to ask them to leave. And these were people that I had created a group for. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, okay. Some people have talked to me about situations like that as well, they've experienced, and they're very unsure. So that's a very difficult case. I think it was probably, like in engaging conversations, it might be easier for somebody who's not that identity, because I think it will be very triggering for them. And also, I don't think you have to necessarily put the onus on people who are marginalized in these conversations. That's something I emphasize a lot. We can all do these conversations. It's something we can all be involved in, especially if you want to be an ally. It's actually really great for you to do this, because often people who are like identity will be asked all the time, like, well, how do you do this? How should I talk about that? But like, I don't have like evidence, for example, specifically on neurodivergence, but there is research showing, for example, because you can have a marginalized identity but still have prejudice views towards another group. So it doesn't mean that every single marginalized person will be like holding hands with every other group, as much as we would like to hope that. So research can show, for example, if you can make that person think about similarities between them and their group and things that hardships that they've experienced, they'll actually be more supportive of that group. So that's, for example, when they, for example, have had like Black Americans engage in allyship for people who are LGBTQ. Thinking about the experience of the Black American struggle and the struggle to gain rights, and then framing that as something similar for example, gay marriage at that time. This was on the paper. That helps them become more supportive. Because I'm sure, from how you describe them, I'm sure these people have experienced disadvantage, probably tremendous disadvantage and marginalization. I think they understand that. So sometimes framing it in that way, that this is something that's also happening to this group, like you, and also like you've been disadvantaged, they can develop more empathy, because then there's a shared identity that we're being disadvantaged in that way.
Okay, so I have like 2 questions.
Yeah.
So my first question would be, in like the racial part of like DEI, how would people like navigate implementing DEI without letting like the workplace become racialized? Because sometimes you can have like minorities in your company, but it's not necessarily like diverse. It's just like one, like, do you know what I mean?
Well, is it like you have like the...
So it's like, so for example, like if you go into like a workplace, it's like, and then you just have like only like maybe like 95% black people, and then like maybe like one white person, one brown person. It's like you could argue like, oh, this is like DEI, but it's not always like it's racialized, but it's not diverse, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. So what's the difference between being diverse versus like a racialized organization?
Yeah. And then my second question is like, I personally haven't experienced it, but then I've been in conversations in like heavily racialized institutions where it's like when there's like certain problems like going on in these institutions, when certain like when white people essentially like speak up about it, instead of like actually taking accountability for the issue, the rhetoric would become you're racist. So like how do you navigate that in like the workplace?
Okay, so the first question, okay, just I want to make sure I understand the point. So the first question is like, what's the difference between like a racialized and
like how do you navigate, like manage the balance between being diverse and being racialized? How would you manage that?
like Matt, so I think, oh, okay, well if you're a racialized organization, if they want you to engage in diversity, and they can do that, like for example, I haven't seen organizations like that in Canada, or I haven't worked with organizations, so I'm less familiar with that to be honest. I've never heard of an organization in Canada that's 95% black, but if they want to...
No, just an example.
Oh, just an example.
Yeah.
If it's, are you saying like, so for example, if a company is filled with like, for example, one race, that wouldn't be, for example, a diverse organization in that way. People just, okay, this is a completely separate topic, but there's kind of the idea, like for example, they have asking, diverse people, what does that mean? Diverse organization, it usually means that there's a lot of racial minorities, but that doesn't have to be the case. So for example, diversity is involving a lot of different identities together, not just, for example, if it's just like all of one race, I wouldn't say as a diverse organization, even if it's all racial minorities, like it's a difference, but yeah, and so your second question was about how like white people can speak up in a racialized organization about racism? Did I?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so I guess the other people in the organization feel like they don't have space to talk, is that why? Or
so
I just wanted to add that.
So in my undergrad,
Yeah.
student union was heavily racialized.
Yes.
And then it was like there were like many issues in the student union, and then like I mean no one ever called me racist, but it would be like when people that were like white would bring up certain issues, instead of like actually addressing the issue, it would be like everyone would go, you're racist, that's why you're attacking us with this. So like it was very tough to like speak about like certain things, because I mean it was technically like a word, it's not necessarily like word, but then it was very hard to kind of like navigate like speaking and talking about certain things because everyone's scared of being called racist.
Okay, so basically they were, okay, so it's kind of like things that seeing a company goes happening in that small group.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also just important, because I'm guessing, okay, I'm gonna guess from what you sound, because you're asking this question, that they were bringing up valid concerns.
Yes.
So it wasn't just racism, they were not right to say.
There was like no racism.
There was no racism, so.
The response to, so it's like, I don't know, it's like how would you like actually like like speaking up about situations in the workplace when it's like without being called a racist person? Like how would you navigate like sensitive topics that might not necessarily be about race when you're scared of race being brought into the situation?
Oh, well, I think that's a pretty unique situation that is not as common in organizations, but if you wanted to bring it up, I think it's just important to also let the people who are in the student group know that allies are also important, so allyship can also be two ways of this way. Like, if you want to do a social change, if you want to do something, especially if you're a smaller group, you do need supportive allies, and I think it's just important to be very cognizant of that way. So if they were coming from a good place, because perhaps, I don't know what happened, so I'm just guessing right now from what you said that maybe they felt very defensive in that way, and there was a lot of, I think, miscommunication. It sounds like perhaps that they were misunderstanding where they were coming from. But yeah, I think that's a lot of interpersonal issues in that area. Yes?
I wonder, and I'm just like, I'm new to this situation, and it's a beautiful conversation that we're having. I'm thinking of Phil Lane Jr. He wrote The Sacred Tree. He talks about how hurt people, healed people attract healed people. And I'm wondering if, because what I promote is identity, is when you know who you are and where you come from, you might have a stronger anchor in your identity. And it goes for all cultures and races around the world. Canada wasn't built on romance. Many people left their around the world to come here, but like there's like, is it the Japanese internment, the downtown history at the little, like the black the community, or the Jews or whatever, like there's been a lot of hurt in this world. So I'm wondering if when we know who we are and where we come from, because when I introduced myself, I did not acknowledge the settler blood in me because I am disowned, but I'm aware and I can just breathe through it and understand that I'm disowned. But yes, I do have my status card. I am a First Nations woman. I know who I am and where I come from, and my teachings are to walk softly or gently with a good heart, because I think at the end of the day, when we're all children and our parents are teaching us values, it's up to us to make those values a part of our being and results oriented. Did that make sense? Yeah. Talking in circles.
Dialogue.
Thank you so much for the talk and for your work. It's really important. About a decade ago, I had a personal relationship with Christopher Woodwell, who was kind of leading the Trump administration's backlash against DEI in the U.S. We had a lot of mutual friends. Anyway, I thought he could be a friend. I think he thought I could be a friend back then. But then that relationship ended, like, for my own sanity, basically. Because my feeling from talking to him about like how he comes to his views around DEI was mostly it had to do with like personal relationships that he's had himself with brown people in his life who are immigrants to the United States and went through all the right steps and achieved a professional degree through education and things like that. And so he's basically saying like merit-based advancement is what the U.S. wants and needs, and anything that accounts for histories of racial oppression and colonialism is no longer valid. But he also has this like feeling of being a victim that's very strongly established, that he feels like he's the victim, he's the minority, he's the radical. Like North American campuses or institutions, like the media is now, like DEI is hegemonic in the media and in institutions like university, and so he's the real radical. And I think like the people that are looking to Charlie Kirk as a martyr, like they're also like in that kind of language, talking about themselves as being radical, and sort of using some of the same language around like anti-racism, but now it's like framing it as like white people are being oppressed. So I'm just like, when people are in that position, like, what do you do as someone who wants to pursue racial justice? Like, do you not talk to them? Like, that's what I did. I posted it, basically. I couldn't handle it. But like, maybe I missed an opportunity. I don't know.
Okay, well, that's a really extreme case, so you can also pick your battles. Also, we have to also protect our own like security and safety as well. But like going to your point about, I guess this is somebody who has a very extreme anti-DEI views, or I'm just going to use the case of the person you brought up.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, it's also like, it's millions of people in the United States that have these views. So like, how do you talk to those people?
Okay, those are some of your relatives. Okay. So I'm thinking of like examples, because I have talked to some people where they just said like, no, they disagree. Some people, I just moved them a little more supportive. So like, let's say they were like a 2 on DEI, maybe they're like a 5 now. That's still not great, but it's still an improvement from before, so I'll use an example of something I had. So I think somebody said something that was very prejudiced. I think a lot of people would have stopped talking to them in that moment when we had this conversation. I did immediately call them out and I said that was incredibly offensive. So I let them know, like, just for other people, but I did like talk to them, like, well, because it seemed up to that point, that person was very polite, very respectful. So I was wondering, like, why would somebody like that say something so horrible? So I did talk to them back and forth, and I came out for them, it was incorrect beliefs. Like, they felt like the group was being disadvantaged now, but I think what they didn't realize was, like, the historical context, because they also didn't maybe grow up in Canada, so they didn't know why certain programs are in place, why this was happening, or like why certain practices are happening, certain inequalities, because for them they're just looking at it like, well, this group is doing less well than this group is just not as good in that. I'm just like keeping it vague to not offend anybody in the audience, so it was pretty offensive. And as I explained that, I think they kind of realized, they actually said, oh, like, I didn't know that was like why this might be caused. And I'm like, no, it's not because, for example, this group has like an inferior culture. It's because there's been things that have happened historically that have created that. And this is something you can Google, like, it's not something I'm just making up. It's a history book. That's kind of why I'm trying to get away with history, but that's another topic. And that's why I think we need people, I think sometimes it's incorrect, so I can figure out for that person that just had an incorrect belief. That person feels as if they are now being disadvantaged for being white. So understanding that, like, do they just see, for example, they're experiencing less advantages now? Because there's like research showing this, for example, like benefiting from discrimination, people don't realize how that happens. They can understand this group being disadvantaged, this group doesn't get this. But when these groups are being disadvantaged, like, where are those opportunities going? It's helping another group. So yes, you might actually have less opportunities than before. That could happen, but it might be because there was already a lot of inequality. You might still have a lot more opportunities, it's just there's a reduction in that way. So I would say it in a nicer way than that, because especially for somebody in that case, but I think just helping them think about it more holistically, thinking about the context, thinking about the history, thinking about the macro level factors. Just meeting a minority, for example, who's really successful, that's awesome, but that's still one person, and that's not thinking about what it's like for the overall group as a whole. And if you just point to that, it kind of just keeps structures in place.
I'm mindful of time, but we have 2 more questions here. I've noticed recently, or as I started working in an entry-level job, sometimes they make it in a way that DEI becomes a chore. In the sense of how we have every 3 months, what does DEI need to, what does DEI need to, and there's no sort of like feedback or any type of like support that comes along with that. And I was wondering, like, do you know, or like any research that's been done on how entry-level jobs, like retail stores or like restaurants and stuff, how can they make DEI more interactive, more meaningful, than rather than just something that's like one training module and one like hotline? And even in that case, like recently there's been like an uprising on how immigrants or a lot of individuals are able to get access to certain opportunities that Canadians are not able to. And when that language comes on, there's no support from workplaces to defend immigrants. Like, I'm an immigrant myself, and I feel like there's nothing that's being done at work rather than does DEI need to do. Here is a training module on how you can be accepting and open-minded, but like, there's not really any open-mindedness that I see from the actual corporate itself. So.
Yeah, so that's a very important question that you have. Unfortunately, they don't really research like how entry-level jobs process like DEI. A lot of it's just been done on like white-collar professionals, like consulting firms, investment banking, tech. That just tends to be where a lot of like business school professors go to research. But I think that's important because even when I was teaching DEI, some students brought up that they felt as if it was too superficial. I'm just saying how to say this. Sometimes you gotta think about why is the organization putting DEI in the first place? Because sometimes the organization is just doing this to check off a box in that way. So that's why it would be very superficial. I think if there are more, because there's a lot of research on DEI trainings, and one-off DEI trainings are not shown to be that effective. It's like an ongoing process. It's something we've been taught about for so long. I mean, it would be amazing if in 1 hour we could undo all of that. That would be phenomenal. I wish it would happen, but it takes multiple conversations. It takes people learning. So I think when organizations are serious, that's why they'll have DEI offices, they'll have places for you to talk, they'll have support groups, they'll have ERG groups in that way. Because like I said, there's research showing that when you have even like DEI trainings and some practices, it makes it harder for you to have a lawsuit because now we can point, well, we had this practice and it becomes less justified. I think that's important though for if somebody can, for example, do it as well in a low-cost way and finding out what the employees care about as well. Because sometimes when you're talking about something in the DEI training, it might not be as relevant or something they can implement at work. Because sometimes they just have similar ones they'll use in different organizations. It might be something you might really need in your job. So for example, you want, for example, people who can help to defend people against anti-immigration sentiment. That might not be something, so I think also that's why it's important to like find out what your employees want and include that into your DEI training. That's also something I try to do as well, to find out where people are and adapt it. I hope I answered your question. Okay, thank you for the question.
Okay. Hi, Megan. Yeah, I guess my question would be like hearing everyone else's stories and questions. Like, do you coming away from just the private space? Because when we talk about DEI, we usually think of like organizations or companies, and that's a very privatized space. So my question would be like, do you see a marriage with, I guess, the public sphere when it comes to DEI? Like, do you see the private and the public coming together? Do you think that DEI has to only occur in the private space? Like, do you think there could be, I guess, collaboration between what the government can do? Like, how do you see public, I guess, like, how do you see public policy playing a role in DEI?
That's very important. I think as we've seen, we can't trust companies to do this themselves.
Yeah.
They will just, because companies are really responsive to what's happening, for example, with pressure. So if there's an anti-DEI pressure, they will respond to that. If there's a lot of protests from their customers, they will also respond to that. And these are things that take a lot of time. So I think, for example, in government, being able to address this. Like, for example, there was research showing that there's been an increase of alt-right groups even in Canada. And so that's actually something that's very important to address, especially for our human security, as these groups are growing, and they've been growing. And this was predicted many years ago, but we also need to address that as well, so putting funds towards that. And then also educating people and also putting in, for example, encouraging companies to do these policies. Like, I've literally been brought in sometimes because they said, well, you know, we have to do this policy, like the government said we need to do this for so-and-so contract, so they're doing it because of that. So that's the kind of things I think that we need, where we educate people on a global level in that way. I think the public are very important actually in DEI companies. I don't think DEI would happen in companies without public pressures. Like, that's how from the action starting in companies, that's how everything's also starting.
Any last question before I ask my question? before giving our speaker maybe a few minutes to offer concluding remarks.
There's a beautiful rainbow celebrating.
Oh!
It's the lead portal. Check it out.
Sure.
I had a quick comment that I was at this book launch in UBC last week. It was Indians on Indians Land. So basically about how the Indians, the diaspora has come and how they need to learn and take responsibility, towards the indigenous people here. And in that, the interesting part was that it has to be a two-step process, because when you come as an immigrant, you bring in with yourself identity. It has a discourse. Then you come to North America, you take another identity as an immigrant. It has its own discourse, its own challenges. And so in that, for example, in the tech sector in America, caste is a very big discrimination right amongst Indians, and they also have this model minority kind of views also about themselves. So in this, they have to go to steps. They have to also undo caste, which is discriminating them, and then they also have to engage with greater responsibility towards the allyship kind of behavior. So it's very interesting that you have multiple identities in you, and each has its own discourse. And often there is a paradox sometimes, and often it is. So that's also another way to kind of look and appreciate. It's a challenge one needs to overcome.
Yeah, especially from your culture, from your upbringing, the caste system as well. It's something that's also that's a view where it's very hard that can carry over in other ways as well. So thank you for sharing that.
So I just have a question, but by way of that question, I just wanted to give you a few minutes to, if you want to offer any concluding remarks. So your article, the title of your article was Beyond Backlash. And listening to all the conversations and your responses, I was thinking, is there such a thing as, or does your work help us think beyond EDI? In other words, does your work help us rethink the very terms of the EDI? Or maybe, I don't know if this is a second question or a follow-up question on that. In your research, with your research, do you think, or how do you think your research will shape how we evaluate success and failure of EDI initiatives in the long term?
Okay, that's a perfect question. So, I think something that I wanted to emphasize is just I don't want to be discouraging, and there's a lot of discouraging things happening right now in the news that we don't need to repeat, that backlash happens because things are working. If your DEI initiative had no impact, there would be no backlash. Why would anyone feel threatened? It's happening because we had changes. And this has happened throughout history whenever people have had to do change. And that's why I'm emphasizing beyond backlash, because now people are having conversations about DEI, we're mobilizing together, we're having conversations, people care more than ever. And this is an opportunity for us to educate people to have these conversations because, like I said, the data I was collecting before was before Trump. People said that they would not talk about these issues, but as we can see now in the news, people are definitely open about these issues and they are being very vocal about it now publicly. So this is actually an opportunity, if you think about it, for us to now talk about these conversations, get it out, why are people thinking this way, and open it in that way. This has happened throughout history, if you look through it, where there's been progress for social rights, and then there's been a backlash for people trying to stop it. But it's not the end, it's just the beginning of change that's happening in our society.
Yeah.